One of the remarkable things about this Asbury revival is that it comes within the context of what I would call a very seeker-sensitive church culture, seeker-sensitive mega-church culture, where by and large, we don't hear about revival anymore. In fact, I can't, and it could just be me, but I don't remember a single revival being talked about since the advent of social media. And I think that's very interesting. I think there's some psychology behind all of that. But just the mere fact that revival is taking place, that it's drawing people like it is in the midst of a church culture where we don't even talk about revival much anymore from the pulpit on a Sunday morning, or make it a part of at least our spiritual consciousness, that this is a reality available to us as believers. And it's like we've just totally thrown out that part of church history, and it doesn't matter to us anymore in post-modernity. So for that reason, I think that it's miraculous, if you want to put it that way. It's miraculous that we're even talking about revival right now.
Yeah, that's, if you did watch my videos, I've done 2 so far. One of the things that I said, I think I said it earlier on the show, is God is faithful to his own glory in every generation.
Welcome to Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman. You're about to make the jump from the dishonest mainstream media into free and independent thought from key thought leaders on the subjects of culture, causes, politics, and faith.
Welcome to Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman. I'm very excited to have an actual old friend on the podcast, and somebody that kind of used to run around in circles that I'm very familiar with, and maybe still does to some degree. But I wanted to bring him on the show today to discuss the Asbury revival. So Keith Collins is joining us today, and I'm going to save a little bit of his pedigree. And not because credentialism means all that much, but it does when we're talking about something as important as revival. So Keith has a long history in circles that have experienced revival. He's been in ministry, I think, 37 years. And again, I'm going to let him do most of this, but I think his impact and input, not only on the body of Christ in the past, but also as it pertains to what revival actually is, why is it so important, and what can we take away from this Asbury revival, especially now that it's been close to the public, I think was an important conversation. So when I saw him post the other day, I wanted to bring him on to have a conversation about what just took place and is continuing to take place in other settings. So with that being said, Keith, thanks so much for being on.
Hey, thanks, Reed. And it's a real honor for me to be on with you, buddy. Good to see you. Thank you.
Me too. So I said that we used to run in similar circles, and maybe in still some ways do, but one of those similar circles is right before I got married, your daughter went on a mission trip with me and my soon-to-be wife. So I don't know if you were aware of that, and this happened probably so we've been married for 13 years now, and so this probably 15 years ago or something like that. But right before we got married, we went on the mission field with your daughter, and we've got a lot of friends and acquaintances in common. But again, one of the most important things is that you posted, or at least important for this conversation, you posted the other day that you went to Asbury, you experienced it yourself, and that caught my attention because of your background in ministry. Not only do you have a long tenure in ministry, but you also have had a tenure in ministry where you have experienced really phenomenal moves of God in the past. So I was just wondering if you could kind of give us a brief history of your ministry experience, because I think that matters and it lends credibility to what you have to say, but also to kind of your experience as it pertains to and intersects with revival experiences in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I was radically born again, and I had a really radical experience with the Lord when I was a teenager there in North Florida. And, I'd gotten into drugs, alcohol. My biological father was a drug addict. He fell dead at age 51. He introduced myself and some of my siblings to narcotics, to pornography. At the age of 8 years old, I started doing drugs with my father. And, he destroyed his life pretty much. I have a younger brother that's been in prison in Florida for 29 years now as a result of the road that my father introduced us to. However, by the mercies of God, he found me as a teenager, and I was literally radically delivered, Reed. It's kind of like a Damascus Road type experience. It really is. And so that was at almost 16 years old, and from that time, I didn't understand it, but I knew that I had to let people know. So, I started preaching pretty much immediately. I didn't know what to say. I just gave my testimony. And actually, the first individual that gave me a platform to preach on was Henry Jones. I was 16 years old.
And for those, by the way, for those who are listening, Henry Jones is the pastor of the church where I eventually gave my life to Christ back in 2000. So he's affectionately my my lead pastor for life, although not necessarily in the present. So, but yeah, keep going.
Yes. So like you said in the intro, I mean, our paths connect in pretty unique ways, obviously. So anyhow, he had me speak, and, you know, from that time, I just knew that this is what I was called to do. So, you know, obviously I just continue to pursue the Lord, and things develop. I got married very young, and then my wife's parents, they were church planters in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky, and so they kind of took me under their wing, and then, you know, really started pastoring my first church when I was 19 years old in the state of Maryland. I probably wasn't ready, but it happened, and the Lord blessed that season. And then when, you know, I got involved in a church in West Virginia, my in-laws' church, and for West Virginia, pretty large church, about 750 people. And I became the associate pastor / kind of youth pastor, and then began to travel out some. And then, you know, when I turned about 27 years old, I began to hear about what God was doing in Pensacola, Florida, through the Brownsville Revival. And it kind of caught my attention, not because...
And what year was that?
That would have been in 1995, so okay. 1995. And it caught my attention because Pensacola is my hometown. I still have a lot of family in the area there in Pensacola. And I just kind of had a desire to really, visit. So our mutual friend, Henry Jones, actually is the one that invited me to go to Brownsville with him. And I went there that first time, and that would have been in 1996, Reed. So it had been going on probably less than a year.
Okay.
But, I had experienced the Lord multiple times in my life, and I considered myself a person of prayer and even fasting, and was just very diligent. We did a lot of street ministry, and my wife and I, and we had seen the Lord just, touch multiple people throughout our tenure of ministry at that point. But when I got to Brownsville, I will have to tell you that there was a tangibility of the presence of God that I had not experienced before, except for the night that I was radically saved on January the 24th of 1985 in Otter Creek, Florida, which is right near Sopchoppy, actually. So anyhow, but when I got there, I was immediately cognizant that there was something beyond a good preacher and good singing and a good church. Yeah. And when I went into the service that night, I literally began to break and weep. It's not that I was in sin at all, but just the holiness and the beauty of Jesus so overwhelmed me. And, after the worship, which literally lasted probably 2.5 hours, it felt like 5 minutes. I found that in these seasons of visitation, I experienced this last Wednesday at Asbury, it's almost like time seems to stand still in a certain way. So that happened there at Brownsville. And anyhow, Steve Hill preached, and then before he preached, a guy named Mike Brown, who's one of my dearest friends, and we're colleagues, and Dr. Michael Brown, just a great scholar. But
he's a podcaster. I think he's on the radio too.
Yeah, awesome man of revival and passion and prayer and missions, and so we've become very, very dear friends, and I've done quite a bit together over the years. But anyhow, Mike Brown got up that night in the meeting, and he announced they were launching a ministry school, the Brownsville Revival School of Ministry. I've been in ministry for years, and I'd had some online training, but I felt like I was supposed to be a part of that school. So I literally was in the pioneer class of the Brownsville Revival School of Ministry. It was a 2-year practical ministry type training school, and of course we studied Hebrew and different things like that, and Jewish roots and New Testament books and Old Testament survey, all the stuff and then practical ministry as well. And immediately after I graduated, Mike Brown said the Lord pretty much showed him that I was supposed to be on leadership there, so I became like the dean of students. And at that time, the school had swollen to about 1,300 students. And then I was the dean. Then I took over pastoral care. I had a whole department under me of counselors because so many people were getting radically saved from drug addiction and just, ferocious lives. And they were coming and getting radically touched by the love of God, but they needed pastoring. So anyway, I was over pastoral care. And then things kind of shifted, and Mike Brown and them kind of broke away from the revival and started Fire School, and I literally became the president of the Brownsville Revival School of Ministry for a season. Then after that time, I actually rejoined Fire again, and Mike Brown and them, and became the director of Fire School of Ministry for about 10 years here in Charlotte. And during that time, I've also been heavily involved with a lot of traveling ministry. I've preached in 37 nations around the world. I've helped plant 5 Bible colleges in Europe, Africa, Eastern and Western Europe, as well as in the Philippines. And so I've done a lot. And whenever the Lord began to move 2 weeks ago in Asbury, it really caught my attention for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm a kind of a student of history, and I've taught on revival history, even revival on collegiate campuses. And Asbury is kind of notorious. The first visitation there is 1905, and they had a couple in the 1950s, the main one in 1970, and now this one in 2023. So it caught my attention, and to be honest with you, I didn't go because I felt like I needed a fresh touch from God. The reason I went is because I have such a passion for Generation Z and even Generation, what they call an Alpha, and even the Millennials. But for the Lord to move so sovereign, even though Asbury College is a Christian college, there's a lot of Christian colleges that have become very liberal in their theology, 100%. Even in their approach to the canonicity of Scripture and the just some of the main tenets of the faith that I hold dear to. And anyhow, when I saw that the Lord was moving there, I told my wife, I said, we just need to go. And I went, and I'll be honest with you, brother, I was kind of overtaken by the love of God, by the glory of God, by the weight of God. And what I saw was just such hunger, especially among young people and young adults. I mean, just repenting, the loving kindness of God being stretched toward them, their hearts being bent towards the Lord, just such a weight of God's love and glory that was so present there. And then the people that just came in from literally around the country and really around the world. So I'll say this, there's no way that a school or any group could say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to make a plan. And here, there's no, and I mean, and this school, it's interesting because this building that this thing broke out in, I mean, you go back in time like 110 years. It's an old building with wooden seats, stained glass, a pipe organ's in there. I mean, I feel like I was in a church in Wales or in England or something, like a church from 50 years ago.
But by the way, I think we'll get into this probably a little bit more. I think that's one of the remarkable things about this ministry too, is how simple it was, and how the people that were over it really intended to be very clear in their focus and what they wanted to accomplish. So we'll get into the things that kind of make this revival remarkable. But you said you were a student of revival, and not only had you experienced, but you've studied it and taught classes on revival in the past. So I want to step back and go to Brownsville in just a moment. Before we do that, let's talk revival broadly. So what in your mind classifies something, historically speaking, as a revival? When we say this is a revival, this is the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, what are kind of some of the earmarks of things that we're looking for to classify something as a revival?
Sure. I mean, let's take the two Great Awakenings. Of course, the first one in the 1700s among the American colonies, and the New England colony was a primary area, especially with figures like Jonathan Edwards. And then, of course, the Second Great Awakening, 1800s, Finney and different ones were being used, Charles Finney, as vessels of the Lord. But here's what I always try to explain to students. The reason they're called awakenings, or the word revival means to revivify or to bring back to life. So the reason it's called a revival or awakening is because somebody's fallen asleep, and usually it's the church. And with that said, I do want to say this, Reed, because I tried to qualify this on a couple of videos that I did on social media. I know, and you know, faithful people of the Lord that have been faithful to prayer, faithful to love this generation that we're in right now, faithful to church doctrine and church dogma. I mean, the tenets of the faith. So right. I understand that. At the same time, I do know that, unfortunately, a lot of the American, not just the American church, but I'm speaking of America now because of what's going on in America with Asbury and now different campuses. In America, there has been a strong focus on production, performance, aesthetics, and that's really become, studying demographics in order to appease to them on a certain level. So historically, we see that God moves in and revives a people that have kind of fallen asleep spiritually. They might be going through the motions of religion, the motions of church attendance. In the first Great Awakening, when the colonists came over, literally the first thing they did in these villages was they would build a church. It was centered to their culture. However, there was a coldness. There was not an intimacy with the Lord. Yeah. Church had become a part of their life, but Jesus was not really real in their life. So the Lord historically has begun to, oftentimes he'll send like a firebrand, someone that has met Jesus in an intimate way, whether it be an Edwards or a Finney, and they have this personal revival, and then they give themselves to prayer and intercession, we see, and the Lord uses their faithfulness in order to bring about a visitation that's really beyond what man can do. And I've been all over the world. I've been to places where these great moves of God have happened. I was in the Hebrides Island off the coast of Scotland several years, probably maybe 7 years ago now, a few years before COVID hit. But I was in Barvis on the Outer Hebrides, which is where the Hebridean revival broke out in 1949. They'd had other moves of God historically before that. The island of Lewis at this time in 1949 is an island of about 25,000 people, small population of people. But some folks in a certain church in Barvis began to really get gripped with God's heart to visit that island again in power and in demonstration. So there's two older ladies. There's a group of young folks meeting in a barn on one night a week. They begin to cry out to God, Lord, send your glory again. They get hungry because the church had become so cold, and a lot of drinking establishments had opened up, and there was just somewhat of a spiritual anemia that had taken place in the church. Yeah. So these folks that had known the Lord began to cry out to God to visit again. And of course, Hebrides had a great revival. You can read the history of it. But I actually met with a couple that were in the revival, and he became a minister. He was 96 and she was 94, the husband and wife. They were still alive. And I sat down. I actually have like 2 hours of recorded interviews with them. But I sat down and talked to them and just asked them, what was it that stood out to you in revival? Mm. And some of the main things that stood out, Reed, was the fact that there were many people that were radically arrested by the Spirit of God before they ever even heard a preacher or ever even came near a church building. Sometimes working in a field, sometimes working at a weaver's loom. And conviction would literally visit them. The Holy Spirit would visit them and bring deep conviction. And they were just radically touched and changed. So
yeah, by the way, you hear these stories about Charles Finney walking through like factories back in the early Americas and people just crying out and repenting just when he's walking through the factory.
Exactly. So anyhow, when I think of revival, to kind of answer your question as good as I can here, it's two things. Number one, it's, I think, God's response to faithful people that have refused to let go of the truth of God's word and still believe that God can visit. Number two, it's really God's loving kindness that He would. God, we know God's omnipresent. We understand that. But there are times when He, in His grace and in His mercy and in His loving kindness, allows the kabod of His nature, the weight, the heaviness of His nature to be experienced in a region, in a nation, among a generation, and that's what I believe corporate revival is. Again, I think you and I can both live in personal revival always, sure. But I don't have to wait. I don't have to wait for the rest of the church to wake up for me to be awake. However, when I'm talking about revival and what we're seeing at Asbury, what I saw at Brownsville, there's an element of sovereignty to it that's almost intimidating. at the same time, it brings great joy.
Yeah, that's good. I like what you said about spiritual anemia and trying to be clear with kind of the spiritual snobbery of just saying well, the church is so backwards and blah, 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 blah. Well, the reality is there are some churches who are doing really great things, and this doesn't undermine that reality. But I think it is also very fair to say, and this will come into play a little bit later as we talk about Asbury specifically, but where we're at today, I think most Christians would agree we're in desperate need of revival. We're in a cultural time where God is needed, not more than he ever has been, but he's needed more than we can probably remember to shift what's going on in our culture. And I wanted to say something else too about this in terms of the academy, because I thought it was very unique that Asbury happened in a school, or that Asbury revival happened in a school. Because I also think while we don't want to demean what's happening in churches around the globe every single time they open their doors, I think I don't want to demean the academy either. But I'm just going to be really, really honest with you that when I went to school, I was seeing back in 2012 in graduate school when I was studying for theology, I was seeing the leftist creep of Marxism among my professors all the way back then. And I think really that becomes the seedbed of what I'm doing now with Indie Thinker is that a lot of people now are scratching their head when they hear about critical theory and critical race theory, and when they hear about left-wing gender ideology, and they wonder how you can literally be a Marxist and a Christian and how those two things go together, or how you can be a second or third wave feminist and be a Christian when those two things are totally juxtaposed to each other. But I was seeing this stuff back in 2012 at a conservative Christian evangelical Pentecostal university. So to me, to suggest that we're in desperate need of God as a culture and individually is no far stretch to the imagination. But I want to talk about this just real briefly about Pensacola. Now, you talked about revival being kind of a visitation of God, but also a revivifying. One of the things that at least I, from secondhand experience, because I experienced Brownsville more via our pastor than I actually did with Brownsville proper. But one of the things that I think I remember about Brownsville is that people were radically getting saved in the hundreds, if not thousands, on a regular basis, on a nightly basis. And there were crowds just like at Asbury kind of wrapping around the building, waiting to get into church. So what were some of the things in the Brownsville revival that you would say were really remarkable or that earmarked that distinct move of God from your past experience?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, definitely hundreds nightly getting really, and many people radically saved. I mean, I hadn't experienced the assistant principal of Wakulla High School, which is the high school there where you and I both lived for a season. Actually, I went to high school there, and I knew the assistant principal, and there was a young man who had really gotten heavy-duty involved in Satanism and the occult and was in trouble by the law, so forth and so on. And he called me. He said, Keith, he said, could you take this guy, I'm not going to give his name, could you take him to the Brownsville revival? He said, he's in a lot of trouble, but he said, I've kind of worked it out. He knew the sheriff and all that kind of stuff. And I've worked it out where he can go with you. Yeah, he can go with you because we know you. So, I'm from the area there. I'd been in ministry years at that time. But long story short, I took this, and this guy, Reed, this might sound radical to some of your listeners, but this guy on the way over there, he was literally had some kind of array. He was cutting his arm and sucking his blood in the car, trying to freak us out. I mean, he was just so far gone, just very dark looking. I mean, gothic looking, but completely into a demonic world that he lived in, and probably demonized. We got there, and he was actually mad that we were going. When he got there, Reed, literally, I'm not exaggerating, when we walked into the door, you could see his face change. We got in there, and Linda Cooley, the worship leader, literally hit the first keys on the keyboard and began to sing. This kid literally walked straight up to the front, and just tears. I mean, matter of fact, it was so supernatural. Steve Hill did not even preach that night because he recognized what God was doing in this. Well, this young man now is a youth pastor in Dade City, Florida. Has been in ministry for years. But radical conversions. I mean, people that would come, from the most horrific backgrounds, would come into that setting and just be confronted with the Spirit of God. And they had one or two options, and I saw both. They either ran out the back door because they couldn't take it, or they ran to the altars. So that was one thing. The lines, people so hungry, man, and not just unbelievers. I mean, there was a lot of first-time salvations, but there was a lot of people that had just become, like I said earlier, anemic or even nominal in their faith, and they believed in God, but Jesus had become more of a mascot than the Lord of their life in their hearts. So the Lord really revivified them. I mean, he woke them up, and they were revived. So we saw that again. Just the fact that people would come there, and I think I'm seeing this from Asbury, and I'm already starting to hear reports from a few different people, would come there and receive from the Lord, and then take that back to their school, to their homes, to their churches, to their communities. I heard multiple stories of marriages that the Lord strengthened. And, one of the things that amazed me the most, brother, I was on the prayer team, which if you ever came to Brownsville, you remember that what they would do is Steve would preach, they'd do an altar call, and then they had this, regularly did this unless the Lord moved otherwise, but then they would have a prayer team, just pray for people, bless people, pray for healing, fresh anointing upon people's lives. And I was on that prayer team for about 3.5 years. Man, there were nights, it kind of freaked me out, to be honest with you. I mean, there were nights when like 65, 68-year-old men would stand before me, who was in my early 30s at the time, and they would say, "Sir, I need prayer. I've been pastoring the same church for 20-plus years.
Wow.
I've been having adultery with my secretary for over 10 years. I've got kids and grandkids, and I've got to go home and confess this and make it right." I remember one guy distinctly came before me just weeping, an old man, like in his 70s, early 70s. He said, "Son," he said, "I've been pastoring for over 40 years, the same church." He said, "I have stolen tens of thousands of dollars from my church. And he said, I know I'm probably going to prison." He said, "But I'd rather get right with God than go to my grave hiding this sin." I mean, that was the level of, that's intense, but
Yeah.
that's the level of refining fire that was burning in Brownsville. I mean, it was supernatural, brother. Only God can do those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, and I experienced that at least in our home church, and kind of the overflow of what took place at Brownsville, which makes me a little bit more, I suppose, in fairness, a little bit more likely to be open to what is taking place at Asbury and then other places like that. Because, man, when I went to our church for the very first time and I saw grown men on their knees, weeping, crying out to God, worshiping the Lord, man, it didn't take me long to realize I was in the presence of something way different than I had ever been in my life. And I'm so thankful for that, because most of the churches I had ever been to, if anybody clapped, they would have looked around and tried to find out who the culprit was. But the exuberance and the joy that kind of earmarked Brownsville and even kind of found its way to our church was something that was so life-giving to me when I first experienced it. So I guess that's why I'm really excited to see what's going on at Asbury. But that hasn't come without some criticism, obviously. There's been, and obviously very quick. Maybe that's because of our social media age, but all the way back in the 90s, when you were there at Brownsville, was there a level of criticism like there is presently with Asbury as to whether or not it's really revival? And maybe there is still to this day as to whether or not Brownsville was a true blue revival. But was that kind of criticism going on back then?
Oh, most definitely. Again, we didn't have Facebook at that time, and however, there were plenty of ways to get the word out, and there was definitely criticism, even within, because Brownsville was an Assembly of God church, is an Assembly of God church, even within other Assembly of God churches within a 50-mile radius of Brownsville. It was kind of like half and half. There were half the people that accepted it, half the people said it was of the devil, so forth and so on. I will say this. There were pastors that I knew, because even today, literally 3 weekends a month, I'm preaching somewhere. I was in Orlando area last weekend. I'll be in Maryland this weekend. I'll head into Newfoundland, Canada in a few weeks. I mean, I'm pretty much on the road at least 3 weekends a month out preaching. So I've known a lot of pastors for many, many years. And some of the pastors that I was connected with, Reed, back during that time that I preached for, some of them multiple times, were really hesitant. And even probably they would even tell you critical from a distance. Mm-hmm. But I would just say, listen, just come. I'm not telling you to come and leave and promote it, but just come. And every one of those that came, they were so overwhelmed by the love of Jesus, by the holiness of Jesus, by the preaching of the pure gospel, by the salvations, that it so affected them. And many of them have never really been the same. I mean, their ministries completely went to a new sphere of intimacy with Jesus, of power, of passion, of prayer, of taking care of the poor. I mean, just feeding programs, supporting sex trafficking stuff. I mean, their hearts just came alive with it was more than a Sunday morning service. And how many butts can we put in a pew? I mean, they literally came alive with a passion to do the works of Jesus in their generation. So at the same time, there's always critics. Every great move of God, I mean, there's always critics, and that's just par for course. I guess Jesus set the tone. There were many critics that he had among the religious, especially, and that's part of it. At the same time, I am encouraged, and this is one thing I've been trying to do, especially because of what God's doing among Generation Z. I've just really been and I'll be 55 soon. I've got 8 grandkids now. I mean, I'm not old, but I'm not a kid anymore. But I've been really, really strongly encouraging people my age and even older. Let's support what God is doing. Let's not, hey, listen, I've got a graduate degree. I'm actually finishing a PhD this year. I've got a graduate degree from an accredited university in theology, and I love all that, and that's a part of my life, and I've taught in scholarly type settings, and I love collegiate studies and professorial type things. But my heart, let's not try to critique this so much and pick this apart. We know there's truth there. We know there's good theology there. Let's support what God is doing among these young people and not shut the door once they get in. Then of course we need to disciple them. We don't want to put dead religion on them, but we need to disciple them and teach them the faith and the doctrines of the church. But let's not shut the door that God is open and just become cynics and critics, because what God is doing, I believe, is very valuable. It's very precious. And I know I'm speaking for Keith right now. I have to be a father right now. And, sometimes fathers deal with messy, messy stuff. And I remember one thing, Reed, that stands out. I just thought of this. There was, on Friday nights, they would baptize people getting saved in the Brownsville Revival. And sometimes, 50, 60 people would get baptized on a Friday night. And I remember one girl standing up. She's probably 25 or maybe younger. And she was like, I don't understand this, but, I feel this. And she said, this Jesus thing is better than sex. I mean, just in other words, and that sounds crazy, but literally, that's all she knew to compare it to, what she'd experienced. And so sometimes they don't have the right, or they don't have the right communication. They don't have our Christian way of communicating. But we need to father and mother as men and women of the faith what the Lord is doing among the young people. So I feel I feel a strong thing on me to warn, especially older leaders, to humble yourself, get off your religious high horse, and love good, love well, and allow the Lord to use you and your real experiences with the Lord to help what He's doing among this younger generation.
Well, I want to jump into Asbury in just a minute, but I think that that's a good point to just kind of have this brief conversation, because I think that there is this tension between, the scripture telling us that a spiritual person discerns all things, but then how do you not also consistently go around being the fruit inspector for everything that's taking place, especially in a generation. And I just talked about this on my weekly kind of current events show. In 2020, there were, among kids who were 6 to 17, there was something like 24,000 kids who were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. 1 year later, 42,000 kids within the range of 6 to 17 were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So I'm just thinking to myself, listen, I want to fight for discernment. I want to fight for wisdom. I even want to fight for being critical about things that deserve critical thinking. But I also want to be very, very careful that we're not doing what Jesus rebuked his disciples for doing, which is trying to cast out somebody who was not against them. And Jesus says, "Hey, if they're not against us, then hey, leave them alone." So how do we kind of toe that balance and keep that tension of being a discerning individual, calling a spade, but also being not so critical that we don't think, get to the place where we think God needs our permission before he starts a revival.
That's a great question. And I think, the way you describe it, it is a tension. I mean, there is a tension there, especially among those of us that are, we've experienced academia and a certain level of scholarship and stuff like that. There's always that that default mode that I can get into, and that I know you're a thinker and a reader like I am, and researcher, and I do a lot of research. So, number one, I think it's important that we never compromise, the foundations of our faith. I mean, that's number one. Beyond that, we also have to recognize that there are wolves. There are people out there that are deceptive. And actually, I'm not going to give a name, but there was a key figure there. I say key, a known figure. A lot of people don't know this. I know this because I have some connection through leadership to the main leadership of the university and stuff. There was, a known leader that they required to leave because that leader is known.
I think I know who you're talking about, by the way. And I was thinking, dude, you should probably be quiet on social media. You're not helping.
Yeah, this leader is known for I'll just say craziness. I mean, not just theologically, but lifestyle and so forth and so on. And just, grandiose, type of, displays and just totally over the top stuff. And I was blessed to hear that they required this person to leave the campus. So on one level, I think we have to be apologists. We have to be theologians on a certain. That's part of our responsibility as an elder in the body of Christ, as a leader in the body of Christ. I mean, I have that mandate upon me at all times, and I know that I'll be judged more harshly according to Scripture than others because I'm called to preach and teach the Word of God. So that's one thing. So we never set that aside. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I don't want to bring about my knowledge of soteriology and pneumatology and all these things that I've studied in depth and choke someone who's experiencing the love of Jesus at this point if they say something wrong, and if there's something that maybe I wouldn't do if I was the leader there, as long as, again, there's not blatant perversion of Scripture and dangerous leadership taking place. So I think it's wisdom to meet people where they're at with truth, and realize that this generation, they can't handle T-bone steaks. I mean, they need the milk of the Word, and they really need to. And this is what I love about revival, because revival does so much better than we can do in our human ability. Revival allows them. The Lord visits, and when I saw those kids there at Asbury read, and I say kids, probably 16 to 25. Just weeping, man. Not because they felt, they were experiencing the love of Jesus. Now, could I critique one or two? Sure I could. Of course I could. But I know that my role is to support them, that generation, and to help them, to teach them truth. Not to compromise truth or church doctrine and things of this nature, but to allow them to be where they're at right now and to have the wisdom to take them by the hand. I always tell people, you preach and teach what you know, but you reproduce who you are. And to invite them into my life as best I can. One of the reasons why we want to do these prayer meetings at our home, because we've always had students around us and still do on a certain level, but it's kind of a different season for us right now. But I don't want to just show people what to do. I want to invite them. Listen, you come into my prayer life. You come into my worship life. You come into the way I treat my wife, the way I treat my kids and my grandkids, the way that I take care of my practical life, my finances, my ministry finances. In other words, invite them into your walk with God, your personal revival realm, and from there, I think we make disciples. But there's always that tension to point out the things that are wrong. I think as I've grown older, not that I've compromised at all. Matter of fact, I'm as stalwart as I've ever been as far as the doctrine of the church and of the apostles and prophets, but my heart is mollified towards especially those that have been, and you brought it up, have been affected by Marxism, postmodernism, deconstructionism, existentialism, pluralism, just an entire generation, brother, that they deal with stuff I never dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to ask you a question about this, Keith, real quick, because this burns in my heart too. One of these things, and I haven't put my finger on why, or even if I'm correct about this diagnosis, but one of the remarkable things about this Asbury revival is that it comes within the context of what I would call a very seeker-sensitive church culture, seeker-sensitive mega-church culture, where by and large, we don't hear about revival anymore. In fact, I can't, and it could just be me, but I don't remember a single revival being talked about since the advent of social media. And I think that's very interesting. I think there's some psychology behind all of that. But just the mere fact that revival is taking place, that it's drawing people like it is in the midst of a church culture where we don't even talk about revival much anymore from the pulpit on a Sunday morning, or make it a part of at least our spiritual consciousness, that this is a reality available to us as believers. And it's like we've just totally thrown out that part of church history, and it doesn't matter to us anymore in postmodernity. So for that reason, I think that it's miraculous, if you want to put it that way. It's miraculous that we're even talking about revival right now.
Yeah, that's, if you did watch my videos, I've done 2 so far. One of the things that I said, I think I said it earlier on the show, is God is faithful to his own glory in every generation. Because like you said, and my wife and I talked about this a couple nights ago, it's amazing that we're seeing this right now. Because like you said, it's been so far out of our view and our thoughts for so many. I mean, of course, me, because of my lifestyle. But, I mean, this might sound funny, but most of the churches a lot of the churches I've been in the last probably 20 years since the Brownsville revival, especially some of the newer church plants that have the the mega church growth model and all that kind of stuff. I mean, for me to preach about revival, the people would look at me like a mule looking at a new gate. I mean, they'd be like, "What are you even talking about?" It's like so far out of their purview. So you're right; it's a miracle, man. I mean, it really is. Again, there's just no way that this could just there's no way. And that's one thing that stands out to me that proves the validity that this is a true visitation, because we're not, I mean, if it was the 1940s, of course, I mean, grandma and grandpa been praying for 30 years and bless God, and everybody goes to church, but not this generation. So for the Lord to move like this in revival fire and in visitation in 2023, brother, it is nothing short of a divine miracle from God, and only God could do this. There's no school, no preacher, no worship. Nobody could do this except the Lord. So he, again, man, his loving kindness towards humanity is kind of overwhelming to me. It's like he gives every generation an opportunity to turn to him, and we see this through the history of Israel. When they would fall into idolatry and the practices of pagan nations that surrounded them, the Lord in his mercy, first of all, would send some blazing prophetic voice, whether it be Isaiah or Jeremiah or, of course, Samuel, kind of like that end of the Judges era, really beginning of the consistent prophetic voices to Israel, whether it be the northern or the southern kingdom, after the monarchy split there. But still just the consistent faithfulness of God to speak to his people. But then the Lord would visit sometimes, and he would reveal his glory to those people again. So his pattern, and again, these are some of the challenging things that I've taught throughout my history, is the nature of God. His pattern is to be merciful, even when we don't deserve mercy. And he's such an amazing God. And, he's also a God of judgment, of course. But even in the midst of, I believe, like you said, the darkest hour that you and I have ever seen in our lifetimes. I mean, I'm a kid of the 80s and, 70s, and born in the 60s, late 60s, but I've never seen, whether it be gender dysphoria, whether it be just the destruction of the family and marriage, the indoctrination of Marxism, and some of these thoughts that were around years ago that have now kind of resurfaced, and how they deliberately came into universities several decades ago in order to infiltrate culture. for God to move in that, brother, it is a divine miracle. That's all I can say.
Yeah, that's only one of the kind of remarkable things, and I mean that literally, remarkable things about what took place at Asbury. But so let's talk about that real quick. So from your experience being there, and I know there's a lot of people who have shared their experience without ever going, so we have you and the benefit of you being there and experiencing that, and then the history that you shared with us. So what were some of the things that you walked away thinking about what is taking place at Asbury?
Number one, what I just said, only God could do this, number one. Number two, I have to be honest with you, I'm shocked. At the same time, I'm not surprised. And the reason I say that is because, in recent months, Reed, probably the last 7-8 months or so, maybe, as I've been out preaching and just meeting with leaders, I've really seen a hunger that the Lord has stirred up in a lot of hearts. So on one level, myself, Dr. Michael Brown, a lot of us leaders, we've been talking about, hey, this is different. Something's different, because we're all out traveling, doing ministry, speaking at conferences, meeting with pastors. I meet with a lot of pastors and even help them with even their budget. I do what I can do to coach and help. But there's just a different level of hunger and thirst. So that's one thing. But again, I was shocked, man, because like you said, only God could do this. Another thing that really impacted me was the radical, and this might not sound too exciting, but the radical humility and hospitality that I experienced there.
Well, that's good.
It blew my mind. Literally, people were coming up to my wife and I. We heard this all around us. Do you guys need a place to sleep? We have an extra room. These are like, college kids as well as young adults, and just they made you feel like they were so honored that you would come. Even providing water and snacks to thousands of people. But just the level of patience, it was almost like the visitation of God is so deep and so strong that the church actually really became the church. It was just the most loving, hospitable, and I've preached, some of the most powerful things I've ever experienced was, first time I went to India. I went with about 35 people, a team of students with me, and when I got there, we got to the little airport in Vishakhapatnam, and I couldn't believe they were going to land a jet at this airport, but they did. But we got out, and this group of guys came and got our, and I was like, no, I can carry them all. No, we want to carry your suitcases. And then we got to the place where we were staying, and we were sleeping on top of a roof, and very crude environment, but such a beautiful environment at the same time. But anyhow, these brothers brought out like a silver wash bowl. They put our hands in the bowl. They were literally washing our hands, and I felt so intimidated. I'm not one that wants anybody to do that for me, but they served us so well. And I found out before we left that one of the men had planted over 3,000 churches, the guy that was washing my hands and carrying my suitcases. So just that radical picture of servanthood, humility, just deep, deep love and unity. Those are the things that just beyond the presence of God and the glory of God, it was like Jesus had walked into the room in and through these people. So those things really stood. Another thing that really blessed me was watching the baby boomers and even really older people, like in their 80s. I felt to go get prayer, not because I was in sin, but I just, I wanted whatever God had there for me, and if it could come through a vessel, because I had a prayer team. So I went up, and I got on my knees, and a dear brother came up to me, probably, I would say, mid-80s. He was a missionary to Hong Kong for years, then a missionary to Vietnam for years, Hong Kong and then Vietnam. And brother just prayed just the blessing of God over me. He said, what the Lord has given me, I impart to you. And he's like literally tears. And he's just, it wasn't just this, in the name of Jesus, no, he was, the prayer there is so rich. And it's like the people are praying the heart of Jesus into those that are receiving. So I've been, in a good way, I've been messed up ever since I left there. And I was there a week ago today. Literally, my prayer time, we had some folks here last night just praying for them, just the love of God, the power of God. So it was, again, there's so many things I could say, but it was just truly an authentic experience in the Lord and among his people there.
One of the miraculous things also too that I came away with, now I'm doing this from a distance, obviously, so I'm just hearing things secondhand, but I wonder if you would remark on this too. One of the remarkable things is the utter absence of things that we have seen in past revivals, being two of them that come to mind. One, and maybe a third, I guess, but one being no like speaker, no like big name guy that's there to draw a crowd, which I think is incredibly interesting. And if you have any history or understanding of revival, that's actually kind of odd, but also not so odd, because I think it was like Leonard Ravenhill that said you don't have to market revival, it markets itself. And then the other thing would be the absence of a worship band. So they had a worship team, but from what I heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, I heard they have a piano, they have an acoustic guitar, and then they've got young guys up on stage singing. But that was it. And I know for a fact there was no like internationally known recording artist there to kind of lead worship that night, and no lights, no smoke, no mirrors, just a pure, sincere outpouring of praise and worship to God, which is so sincere. And then I guess the third thing, which kind of backs all this up, is I don't know if you saw Tucker's, not his interview with the guys over at Asbury, but when he said, I want to come on, I think it was last Friday. But he reported on his show that they asked him not to come simply because they don't want to make this about publicity and about being on Fox News, but they want to just make this about seeking Jesus. And Tucker at the end of that said, God bless them for turning us down, because he had seen so many people in the industry who were only seeking publicity for their own kind of self-aggrandizement. And so all of this kind of goes back to just the motive of the heart of the people that were there at Asbury, which to me was so remarkable.
Yeah, again, I think, but one of the maybe the hallmark of what's going on there is simplicity. Not only did they not have smoke machines, lights, a fancy, soundboard, all that kind of stuff, they didn't even have a screen to read the words off of. The people were singing. I mean, in my mind, I'm like, they could at least put a screen up here. But God doesn't need a screen. And I do know this, again, because, I know some people that are really connected with leadership there and stuff. There were big-name speakers and worship teams and worship leaders. If there was one there the night we were there, we know her well. She's good friends with, she's probably the leading female worship leader in America right now as far as her ministry and stuff. And she's good friends with my youngest daughter, who has Jude, our grandson, special needs, and she really prays for him and communicates with Hannah a lot. But she was there. And so there are not to lead worship. She came to receive, but people like her began to call the university a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 days after it broke out, and offering their hey, we'll come and we don't need to get paid, we don't need this. Preachers came to share. They said we don't have, but they would not. They didn't want it. They didn't want it to be about a personality. And man, I love that.
Yeah.
I mean, I love it. I mean, so literally, and there were people there. I knew they were there, and many people would know their name. I'm not going to mention their name, but they're up in the balcony with baseball hats on, kind of like just receiving. So that really stood out to me as well as just the way that the Lord, in a culture that's so driven visually, and that's so driven by media and technology. I mean, for him to move in the simplicity like he's moving, it shows he is enough. Leonard Ravenhill, back to Ravenhill said, the early church had much endowment and empowerment. He said the modern church has much entertainment and little empowerment and endowment. And so just, the manifestation of the way the Lord is doing this, it's almost like he's kind of sticking his finger in the eye of modern thought and just saying, listen, I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. And so, there is a beauty in the simplicity. However, that simplicity is coupled with a depth of visitation that far supersedes and trumps anything that we can do through technology, through sound, through entertainers, through big names. I mean, that's the nature of the kingdom. And, there are moves of God, especially the Welsh revival that broke out in 1904 in in Wells, in Lockar Wells at Moriah Chapel. I've been there many times as well. Got dear friends. I do ministry in that part of the world from time to time. I have dear friends with revival history there. But, Evan Roberts was an unknown 26-year-old coal miner, and he wasn't a preacher. Matter of fact, they said oftentimes he would stand and just cry, and the Spirit of God would just fall. But the revival, Wells had revival in the 1800s, but that's what's known as the land of revivals. But this one in 1904 that we know so much about, which is 2 years prior to the Azusa Street outpouring on Bonnie Brae, then Azusa Street in Los Angeles, 1906 to 1909. But this 1904 awakening was really connected to worship and singing more than it was known as the revival of hymns and songs. And a lot of great hymns with deep Christology came out of that song, or came out of that move of God honoring the Lord. So there are some patterns that are similar, because really this thing that God has done at Asbury, you're right. I mean, there's like a baby grand piano, a 6-string guitar, and not even a set of drums, but just a beatbox that somebody sits on and just hits the box. Yeah, that's it. But man, the anointing on those guys, and they would rotate out probably every 2 hours. And then people said there is some preaching. I mean, there's not like a Finney or something like that, but they definitely read the Bible a lot. They even have different young people coming at reading scriptures, but then they also will bring sometimes periodically. I think two while I was there. They would come up and do like a 10, 15-minute exhortation and bring a challenge or bring an encouragement with the word. So some of that is going on. It's not just singing, but it's predominantly just worship and prayer. But there are other things taking place there that I witnessed myself.
That's awesome. So I want to talk about what we figured out just this past week, that they were actually closing Asbury to the public as a result of a couple of different things. So obviously, in the spirit of being charitable and not just cynical, I want to talk about this because I think it's of interest and I think it's intriguing to talk about. So what are your thoughts about setting an official end date for the revival? Now, I want to be fair and just say that they haven't technically done that, because they're still ministering and trying to refocus their efforts on high school and college students. And so it's open to them, but otherwise they've closed it to the public. So I'll be totally honest and say I had kind of torn feelings here. I kind of felt like they shouldn't give in to the pressure that it seems that the city was giving them, because it's a small town outside of Lexington, Kentucky, and it was being overwhelmed by people who were coming from all over the world. But I think to myself, hey, don't step in the way or stifle the move of God. But then I also am sympathetic to the idea of, hey, we are who we are. We're going to focus on young people, and that's what God's called us to do, and that's what we're going to do unapologetically. So I'm kind of in the middle between and kind of torn by how I feel about the fact that they seem to be experiencing a genuine move of God, and then put an end date on it. And so I go back to Leonard Ravenhill here, and why revival tarries, and the reason why it doesn't is just simply because of a lack of prayer and a lack of hunger. So what did you come away with your impression of the fact that this lasted for about 3 weeks and then it was done?
Yeah, well, I guess my impression comes from, number one, being there. It is very small. I mean, it's like, have you been to Wilmore before?
No, I've driven past Wilmore because I used to live in Cincinnati.
Yeah, it's like the size of Crawfordville, Florida. It's a tiny. Actually, the school. Of course, there's Asbury College across the street is Asbury Theological Seminary, but those buildings that comprise both those campuses are really, that is the town. I might have saw one gas station. It's very tiny. So you're dealing with sewage issues. I mean, I'm being practical. Sewage issues or bathroom issues. You're dealing with just people literally can't get out of the driveway to go to work. I mean,
people were parking in driveways and parking in businesses.
Yeah, I mean, just this huge influx. So practically, I understand why they did what they did. At the same time, I'm like you. I'm challenged. I'm like, man, put big tents up outside. Let's just make it happen. You know what I'm saying? But I do kind of understand where they're at. And I will say this. I don't. And this is something that I'm speaking to what I've been seeing, and not just myself, many other leaders that I know. I don't think that what God's doing is just supposed, in this generation, is supposed to be contained to like a Brownsville type setting, where everybody just comes to one place. And that's why I think instantly it seemed like, within 3 or 4 days, we begin to hear reports of this campus and people are praying here. I know I've got pastor friends right now. Awesome church I preach at in Dothan, Alabama, which isn't too far from Crawfordville, Florida, that we both talked about here today. But man, they're young people. They've been in like prayer for like days now. I mean, just a youth group, and they have a school, a K through 12 school, 100-something kids, and like the kids are so. In other words, I'm seeing this thing spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
I think Asbury was a match that kind of lit this flame, but I really believe that this thing is supposed to spread. It's not just supposed to be something that's housed at one place, one campus, one region, and that the Lord is going to supernaturally, allow this thing to really continue to spread. So, but again, at the same time, I mean, of course, I wanted my kids to go. I wanted my grandkids to go.
Yeah.
I have friends that are calling me now because they were planning to go maybe in a couple weeks as they worked at their schedule and they're not able to go. But at the same time, man, I preached at a church this Sunday near Orlando. Again, I don't try to extend services, but nobody would leave. Matter of fact, I had to leave the church at 1:45 to drive back to Orlando and get a plane back to Charlotte. When I left, 85% of the church was still on the altar, crying, going after God. So God's doing something, brother. And I think He used Asbury. And again, it's interesting that the Lord has visited that place multiple times. This is usually they've lasted 4 to 5 days or 3 to 5 days. So this is much longer than normal. And of course, because of media and because of the attention, Fox News and stuff, this one just exploded. But I believe that it's just the beginning. We're seeing things at Sanford College, Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee, a lot of different places, in Cedarville, Ohio, a university there. And I believe the Lord's just going to continue to pour out. I really do. I think we're in a season of true visitation. And I'm not saying thus saith the Lord, but even maybe the beginning of real awakening in our generation. So.
Yeah.
So anyway,
well, He's certainly not relegated to any temporal space and in any one location. So I'm all for it. And here's the idea that I came away with all of this is that there are all sorts of things that are fleeting in life that are absolutely essential, like your breath. It doesn't last very long, but you have to have it. It's necessary for life. So regardless of, and I think the guys over at Asbury did a great job of this too, by the way, regardless of how long it lasted, what ultimately I do believe is a good metric for an authentic revival is the lasting fruit and the impact that it has in the city and in our family and in the places in our workplaces all around us. So eventually, these times of visitation have to lean into the Great Commission. So when in their statement, they were really, really clear that that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to move from what took place into God-honored serving your neighbor. So I was really thankful for that. So I guess the last thing, I want to give people an opportunity to access some of your materials, some of your books and stuff. But before I do that, what do you think, if you could just say one thing about the legacy of what took place there? I know it's early on still, but what do you think that the legacy of Asbury is?
I think the legacy will be a divine, sovereign visitation that led to an expansion of the Great Commission throughout America. I mean, I really believe that. And even beyond, I think it's one of those things that's going to have a living legacy connected with it. I mean, I'll tell you this, Reed. It is very rare, and I go all over the world, very rare that I go somewhere where I do not come in contact with someone who was not radically touched through the Brownsville revival. And I've been blessed. I was over two schools. I've been blessed to train and send out hundreds and hundreds of missionaries around the world that came through the Brownsville revival. And man, they're doing it. They're planting churches. They're pulling kids out of sex trafficking in Thailand and the Philippines.
Yeah.
They are winning the lost. They're discipling people. They're planning ministry schools. They're helping people with culture and society. So I think that will be the lasting fruit. That in the midst of this dark culture, that God visited again, and as a result, the Great Commission was really expanded in a supernatural way.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, you've got a book that I think will help us in the process of understanding the necessity of revival, maybe in a couple of different ways, because you've got a book on your first love and making sure that you live a sustained surrender. And then the one that I'm particularly interested in that I'm going to have to buy is A World Without Absolutes, Discerning the Perils of Postmodern Thought. So certainly you've been kind of analyzing what state we're in and our need for God for a while. And I want people to gain access to those resources. So where can people find that, and what would you recommend for them?
Well, the easiest way to find them is you could just go to Amazon and just type in my name, Keith Collins, and it'll show books. Just click that, or Keith Collins, A World Without Absolutes, or First Love Fire. That's the easiest place to get them. And what was your second question? I'm sorry.
Well, where can we find them? But also, too, you have a personal website as well, right?
I do. Yes, I do. Actually, I have two. My personal one is you can just go to keith-collins.org, and on there, you can find where I'm speaking. You can find, things that we're involved in and so forth. And so we're actually in the process right now. I've got a guy down in Central America. He's redoing both my websites because we're going to be bringing on a lot more available. Like I have several classes that I've done on postmodernism, biblical worldview, books of the Bible, leadership, training, church planting, and we're going to have hours and hours and hours of resources connected to the website. So that's literally happening right now. But so anyway, you can visit us again. Keith-collins.org is the best one to go to right now.
Okay, and I always love to ask this question because I know it's true that you have a favorite child, but you just never want to tell anybody. And books are something we pour our life into to create, much like a child. So I love asking, which is your favorite book that you've written that you would recommend to people?
I would probably, honestly, the book that I just wrote, it's kind of different than my other books in the sense that I actually use some personal experience, and I felt the liberty to do that. Usually my way of writing is not really that way, but this one I felt to use some personal experiences, and I really believe that First Love Fire, subtitle Living a Life of Sustained Surrender, I don't believe you can read it and not be impacted in a positive and in a challenging way. So I would really recommend that. As far as the biblical or the A World Without Absolutes, I literally took a 80-something page graduate research paper and boiled it down to 7 bite-sized chapters that young people could read, because there's not many young people wanting to read a daunting, paper like that. So, but that's an important book as well. And then Samuel's Arising. It's really a call for the church to awaken and to become the voice that God's called us to be. But yeah, definitely First Love Fire right now is my favorite book child.
Awesome. Yeah, I feel that too. I'm in the process of writing something that's my only. So it's my favorite, at least at this point in time, if I ever finish it. But make sure to go check out keith-collins.org or impactgf.org, where you can access those resources and also listen to past teachings from Keith. Well, you've been a blessing to the body of Christ. Thank you for everything that you've been sharing online about what just took place and continuing to kind of stoke the legacy of revival and stoke the next generation toward revival. So thank you for everything you've been doing, and thank you for a continued ministry of gracefulness towards others.
Thank you, Reed, and thank you for what you're doing too as well, brother. I appreciate you.
All right. Thank you guys so much for watching as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and most importantly, go with God. We'll catch you next time.
Our thanks again to our guests for being on the show today. Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman was brought to you by our sponsors. If you like what you heard today, please do us a big favor and give it a 5-star review and like it and share it with friends. And if you want to hear more awesome guests, make sure to check out past episodes. Indie Thinker is a nonprofit paid for by our sponsors and the generous gifts of people like you. In order to hear more great guests like you did today, please consider giving a tax-deductible gift by going to indiethinker.org. And just remember, your voice matters, but infinitely more when you think for yourself.